Hello.
Hello. This is good.
Okay, yes, I've got my headphones in, partially in.
So we're talking to Meagan Day, staff writer at Jacobin and member of what chapter of DSA?
East Bay.
East Bay DSA. Is there any other way that you would like to be identified?
Those are the main ways that I like to be identified, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just went with the I just watched your Why Progressive Isn't Enough talk that you did at night school.
Good.
And so I just ripped the intro, I think, from that.
Perfect. That's great.
Yeah. So, softball question: why were you traveling?
I was traveling down to Los Angeles because it was my birthday week and I haven't had a vacation since April. So I decided to go down to LA with my little brother, who is 16 years old, and we went to a show together on my birthday. Pine Grove, very good band.
I saw your tweet. Yeah.
Yeah. So we just like hung out. I was just on vacation, and then on my way back up, I did an event with Santa Barbara DSA, which was a debate between me and someone else representing the pro Bernie and pro Warren positions, which was really great. And you can listen to the audio of that online now. Actually, they were really quick with it.
Well, I'm going to make a note to put that in the show notes because that's, I think, related to a lot of what we're going to be talking about.
Great.
I reached out to you after we all read the Warren and Sanders are playing a different game. I think that was something like the title, but after we read that, and it seemed to be at that point, it was when like Warren had really started to pick up steam. At least in the media, and the media was that was probably the first week they were saying that she was the main challenger to Biden.
Yeah, that's right. Are we recording now, or are we just like chit-chatting beforehand?
We are recording now, yes.
All right, cool. So in that, I'll just comment on that and say, yeah, what was that, like 6 weeks ago or something?
About that, yeah.
I think that in the Bernie land, a little bit of a panic set in right at that moment. And there are a couple of different ways that it could have gone. One of which was to unfairly tear down Elizabeth Warren as a sort of like obstacle in her own right and make, I think, probably unfair comparisons to Hillary Clinton, for example.
Right.
And then the other response, and the one that I think that I and other people were hoping to provide leadership on, actually, is to draw out the political distinctions between the two of them in a way that actually elevates the conversation. So I actually caught a lot of flack for stepping out early and criticizing Warren, but to my mind, I was trying to respond to the situation as it was unfolding by, introducing a level of, I guess, political analysis to it that probably would have been lacking if lots of people hadn't done a lot of hard work to get us right on that question. Now, it's not like that was the first time that I've written about the differences between Sanders and Warren, but you guys have, I'm sure, noticed that it's like suddenly, all of a sudden, it seems like this is the question that's preoccupying everyone in a certain section of the political space or whatever. So I think it's calmed down a little bit now. People are starting to figure out how they feel about it, and the panic is starting to subside. And hopefully the political themes are coming out a little bit stronger.
No, I think a theme that's emerging, at least on like Twitter, with people that are constantly 24 hours talking about the differences between Warren and Sanders, is like a potential fear that, say Bernie wins. This is clearly a pro-Bernie podcast, and you're very vocally pro-Bernie. Say he wins. Elizabeth Warren needs to be part of any sort of coalition that he forms, and like any sort of like smear tactics against her, if they're unwarranted, are going to make it so much more difficult for there to actually be like a mass movement that includes both bases of people.
Yeah. At the same time, I also think that we can't. There's been from the other side almost a strong insistence from that there be some kind of unity pact or truce between the supporters of both candidates, which I think is equally problematic. So the question is how to, because this is a primary and only one of them can win. And furthermore, I wouldn't just stop there. I would say this is also an excellent opportunity for us to be having, I mean, with Warren in the race, I think that poses problems for Bernie Sanders' victory, which I don't like. But I think that it presents opportunities for us to have a much more nuanced conversation about the different paths available to us to achieve progressive or left reform. A conversation that is much elevated over the conversation that we were having in 2016 when it was, Bernie versus Hillary. So, there are pros and cons to that. And so, like I said, I think it is an opportunity, and I don't like the injunction on criticizing Elizabeth Warren on political grounds, just as much as I don't like the idea that we're going to go so hard that we'll blow up any chance for a potential coalition between the supporters of these two
Yeah,
candidates.
I mean, it's insane to think that they're on the same side, or that like we can narrow it down to like, well, there are minor differences between them, but they're running against each other.
Well, there's a fundamental, and people that have run against each other have been fundamentally similar, though. But like, there's the fundamental difference, as you've pointed out multiple times, is that Elizabeth Warren doesn't have a problem with capitalism and doesn't point to that as her main problem with what's going on. But also, we've had a discussion in our group chat where, one of us has been, and it's not, I'm talking about, I've just watched this happen. But
that narrows it down.
One of us has been very vocally anti-Warren, like drop out Warren. And the other one has been like, no, Warren is actually elevating the conversation for Bernie by being there and not making him look like a crazy old kook. What do you think about that? Like,
I don't, it's really hard to say because there are the electoral concerns and then the sort of broader rhetorical political concerns. And I think that it's different in each of those arenas. So if it was just Bernie versus the rest of the field, I personally think that Bernie would be polling better.
Right.
Okay.
Now. I think that Warren is actually taking some of Bernie's base. I think that there are people who were in Bernie's coalition before who were not actually they were too progressive to vote for Hillary Clinton, but they weren't entirely comfortable with the idea of a political revolution. Right. And Warren has appeared and given them basically their perfect Goldilocks candidate, and so they've migrated over. We could sit here and say, well, good riddance, who needs them? But we actually do need them because elections are numbers.
We need to win.
So in that sense, I do think that Warren is posing an electoral obstacle to a Bernie Sanders victory. I mean, if it was Bernie versus the rest of them and no Warren, I have a hard time imagining that he wouldn't be. It wouldn't be like him and Biden as the front runners, and then Biden eventually sinks because he's just a complete embarrassment to watch. I mean, it seems like a much clearer path to victory for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Now, the question of normalizing Bernie Sanders's platform is a separate one. I do think that Elizabeth Warren is helping in that regard, but it's kind of like a double-edged sword because in order to normalize it, she is tacking a little bit to the center on basically everything. So a good example would be Medicare for All, which she is supporting, and she gets up there on the debate stage and she does a really good job explaining the reasons why we need Medicare for All. But she has a really hard time with the specifics of Medicare for All to the point of actually muddying the waters and making it more difficult for Bernie Sanders to push his vision forward because she's not fully embracing his vision. What she usually does is say like, if she's asked about the details of Medicare for All, she'll just be like, I support Bernie Sanders' plan. I co-sponsored his bill. If you want details, you go look there. And then she'll stand on stage the very next day and say, look, Medicare for All is just a sort of horizon or a set of ideas, or actually, to use her literal words, a framework without details. And we're going to fill in all that stuff later. And it's kind of leaving it more open-ended. So the question, it's not entirely clear to me that, like, let's just take Medicare for All as an example. Is she pushing forward the agenda for Medicare for All? In some sense, yes. When she stands up on the stage and it's not just Bernie Sanders looking like he's some like crazy old guy with like a crazy idea beyond the pale, then yeah, she's helping. But she's also pulling it back toward the center and making it a little bit more ambiguous than Bernie Sanders wants to make it, which could be a real problem, actually. as we try to get Medicare for All passed in the iteration that Bernie Sanders has, written it to the letter in his bill.
Yeah, she's used the phrase "no one would go broke" from medical debt, and
just short of it.
It sounds nice and appealing because there are so many people that's the number one issue in their material life is they're going broke for medical debt or they're afraid that they might. But using that kind of language without the specificity of we need single payer, free at the point of access, Medicare for all, and even like an NHS type system, without being that specific about it, it does seem like it leaves it so open to sort of interstitial public option type things, and
apparently she's going to come out with a plan. I just saw this today on Twitter from Dave Weigel at the Washington Post. She's going to come out with her own Medicare for All financing plan in the next few weeks. I think she's been really spooked by the response that she's received from the right and the center to Bernie's funding mechanism, which is universal progressive taxation. So when I say universal progressive taxation, that doesn't actually involve everyone because some people are under the threshold. They just don't make enough money that they would pay taxes into this thing. But otherwise you do. And the more you make, the more you pay. It makes sense. It's a good plan. I actually have a lot of ideas for why that's exactly what we should be doing. And I can explain those to you. But in any case, Elizabeth Warren has been really spooked by the response to that. Because the center and the right love to shriek their heads off about raising taxes as though it's the worst thing that one could possibly imagine.
Right.
Even, of course, if the tax increase on ordinary people is significantly less than the amount that they're paying for healthcare, right? So she's kind of backed off of it a little bit. I'm not entirely sure what she's going to come out with, but the fact that she's coming out with her own plan for Medicare for All financing tells me that she is basically caving a little bit on Bernie Sanders' vision. And she's trying to find another way to sell it that's less scary, I guess. But the problem is this. Medicare for All is going to be very scary to some very powerful people. And they will use every tool at their disposal to scare other people away from it. And so if you want to pass Medicare for All, this is not the kind of behavior that you need to be indicating from the very beginning. You need to be unflinching. You need to be unambiguous. You need to not be afraid of the fact that people are going to be a little spooked by an ambitious new idea. You need to figure out ways to explain to them why your idea is actually the best possible thing for them and build a coalition that can fight for it. So if she's backpedaling this early on it, and like I said, I don't know what her plan is going to contain, but I just don't think that it's a good sign.
Yeah.
I want to go back a little bit to like talking about the effect of Warren being in the race, because I do think there are a couple more benefits. One is that I think the only way Bernie's candidacy could have possibly moved the Overton window further than it did in 2016 is if there was another progressive candidate forcing people to talk about capitalism explicitly. When it's just Bernie, I feel like he's just the progressive candidate. But when Warren's in the race, he's the anti-capitalist candidate. And like, I also think that if like I've been looking at the polling averages, and it seems that when Warren spiked, Bernie stayed pretty steady. Like it didn't seem like she was poaching too many of his didn't seem like she was poaching too much of his base, and like which is kind of disturbing to me in a weird way because it suggests that it's like less about material concerns and more about like brand, which is upsetting. But yeah, I don't know.
My explanation for that is that there's a difference between the people who came into 2019 already on Team Bernie, and those people have not migrated over. And then there's a difference between those people and the people who voted for Bernie last time, but the jury was kind of out on what they would do this time. And I think a lot of those people ended up in Warren's camp. But you see how those are two different groups, because there was a group of 2016 Bernie voters that came into 2019 less in love with him than they were keeping their options open, perhaps because even though their distaste for Hillary Clinton was enormous, such that they've ended up voting for Bernie Sanders, they were not totally sold on the idea of, a political revolution and basically everything Bernie's selling. And so it's hard to say how much of his support base she's actually reaching into. I think that Warren is actually drawing from all sides, like a sort of bicycle wheel with spokes pointing in every direction. She's a very unique candidate in that regard. Bernie has his own coalition, and it's actually changed since 2016 as well. His coalition has become, the most racially diverse coalition in the race. The youngest, the most female. These are from the Pew Research Center poll that came out a couple months ago. I think it's probably changed a little bit, but not enough to justify me, not enough for me to not say that that's still the case. I mean, he definitely has the most diverse, the youngest, and probably still the most female support base in the race, and definitely the most working class support base in the race, which is really fascinating, because last time this was apparently a huge deal, right? Like the fact that his support base was seemingly comprised of Bernie bros, which wasn't even true last time, but certainly it's definitely not true now. And suddenly the concern that preoccupied everyone in 2016 seems to have melted away, right?
If you would have told me when I was like the lone, like, fucking anarcho-socialist dude at various high schools in like 2007 that everyone who was a leftist was going to be characterized as a bro, I would have been so shocked.
Yeah.
It's still wild to me how
it was
well
smart
that
of them to do that.
caught on. It did.
It was. Yeah. It was a clever maneuver, and it's something that we've really struggled to bounce back from. That's how you know it was so clever. I don't know. People still mobilize that, even though it has no real basis in reality.
Yeah. People also still say that Bernie supporters are rich and on their parents' insurance, and I'm just like, have you ever met anyone in DSA?
Yeah.
Right. That actually is something that bothers me a lot, is the idea that, so the DSA's base, DSA's membership is largely downwardly mobile middle-class millennials, which is to say people who grew up with like a certain, right? People who grew up with like like a certain amount of financial security and
certain
found
expectations
that security
about their life
rapidly eroded, typically upon their graduation from a 4-year university or college.
But a lot of people in New Orleans didn't even go to college. I mean, at least DSA New Orleans might be different because New Orleans in general is different. I don't know. Benjamin's the one who actually does anything in DSA. But like, I don't feel like anyone in DSA really came from like a super financially secure background. But anyway,
there's always some rich kids that show up to stuff, but they're cool for the most part.
I mean,
it takes all kinds. I think, in our DSA chapter, we have like an enormous spectrum. I would still say that the bulk of people who are really active in our chapter are reflected in the sort of summary that I just gave. But it's really it's really not the case across the board. And this is basically I saw a tweet that said this, and I've seen other iterations of this before, but the delegitimization machine when it comes to socialism is so totalizing that basically if you are from a wealthy background and you're a socialist, you're a hypocrite. If you're from a middle-class background and you're a socialist, you're just trying to be edgy and to rebel. And if you're from a poor background and you're a socialist, then you are just jealous and resentful of rich people. And you're also lazy as fuck. Why are you asking for handouts? Just get out there and try to make something of yourself. So that's everybody. That's literally every person is not allowed to be a socialist.
Right.
So we shouldn't put too much stock in it. But I worry that it is somewhat effective smear tactic. And the Bernie bro, it kind of gets lumped in with the Bernie bro stuff a little bit on the periphery.
Right. It is very, very frustrating because a lot of women that I talk to who I respect and love, who actually aren't the kind of people who would actually hurl these insults, do believe that like there is this sort of coalition of people on the internet who are attacking women for supporting Bernie Sanders. And I don't really think that's any more true than it is true that if you tweet anything, someone will be an asshole to you. Like, I don't think that Bernie fans are any worse than any other fans online.
Sometimes I think they might actually be a little bit like meaner. And I say this as one of them. But I would say that's sort of like epiphenomenal to the reality that people who are in Bernie's corner are extraordinarily passionate and feel like this is not a hobby.
No.
This is
Right.
not like, it's not
Politics
like
is
window
not a
dressing. It's
game.
not a party trick.
Yeah.
Like your preferred candidate is not something that you pull out at a dinner party, right?
Right.
Like a lot of people feel like their future is riding on this. And so people tend to go harder for Bernie
Yeah.
Sanders on the internet. And since they're going harder in general, there are going to be like, moments in which like the way that they go hard looks like something that all of us would not.
But having
of.
fangs is good politically. Like, I think that that's a good thing. That does. I don't think that's attacking. Or,
It's just easy to rebrand.
yeah, of
as
course, right.
harassment.
I think that it's just people aren't used to people having fangs, and like civility is obviously not accomplishing anything. So
I mean,
yeah.
Any read of history that you think anyone got something done by being like very polite and like gentle and like doing a lot of, I don't know.
I guess the distinction is I don't see a lot of people.
Horrible,
I don't see a lot of Bernie supporters who are being called out for attacking people, actually attacking people, because I would view attacking people as like, posting or just saying things that are personal attacks about the person or their appearance or something like that. I don't see that. I see people being like, "Oh, you're stupid because of this opinion,"
Right.
Which is to me normal. I'm very mean. I feel like that's very fine to say.
The world is on fire and you're doing nothing, and that's dumb.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it makes people really mad, actually.
Yeah.
The fact that the world is on fire and there are other people who seem to prefer it that we do nothing. It makes people really mad, which is totally justifiable. And when you do see stuff that seems to cross a line, which I'll admit that I occasionally see, I tend to think of it like it's like, I don't know if I said this already to use this metaphor, but it's the tip of the iceberg, and underneath the water is this big well of like this huge solid mass of political feeling, which is such an incredible opportunity. So I don't want to focus on these little blips. And furthermore, I am a very vocal Bernie supporter on the internet, so I get to see what it's like to be on the other side of that, and people say crazy shit to me constantly. Like I get a Warren supporter recently. This was a really fun one. Called me an ignorant bitch for supporting a misogynistic candidate.
I saw
You can just say that it was Nate Silver. It's okay.
Oh, that's good.
So, and like, as I said, when I like highlighted that, or maybe something else that I saw, I said, like, this is not Elizabeth Warren's fault that this is happening.
Right.
Definitely.
And I'm willing to say
That's a good
that.
opportunity.
All it means is that she has a large base that consists of millions of people who have internet access, and people are fucking crazy. But it's not her fault. But I there is a double standard where it's like always Bernie Sanders' fault if somebody like steps over a line or whatever. You see that constantly, and it does drive me up the wall.
I wonder if Bernie Sanders knows how to use Twitter.
I highly doubt it.
Yeah,
I highly doubt it.
What is your read on the role of? We talked about this a little bit. What's your read on the role of like downwardly mobile middle class young people in the moving of the Overton window to the left? Because it seems like people who it seems like young people who are like very media savvy, realizing that what they were led to expect from their lives was evaporating. Like it elevated sort of people who never were working class, like it elevated the interest of people who were never working class because suddenly they had something in common. Whereas like if it had just like the uprising seems like it might have been fomented a little bit by like basically people not getting what they felt entitled to.
Like the disintegration of people who expected to be in the like professional managerial class, and then all of a sudden, whoops, you got to go to work.
Exactly. I mean, it's a
sure. I hear that. I think that I hear that a lot from people. I've had it used sort of against me personally before, like, oh, you thought that you were destined to be like better than everybody, and it turned out that you were just the same as everybody, and that makes you mad, and that's why you're a socialist, and that's the sort of angle of attack.
That's
right?
such a
but I think that's a misunderstanding.
Attack.
What'd you say?
I said that's such a mean-spirited, like disingenuous attack. Like, oh, you thought you were so good, but you're just like that's like playground shit.
Yeah.
Also, what's the conclusion of that logic? Is like you thought you were so good, and now you realize you're just like everyone else, so you're fighting for the interests of everyone else. Like it's like the
right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think that's the kind of where I was going with that. And I think also that there's a misunderstanding where people who are making that argument, who I think are like I heard that argument quite explicitly from somebody who's a self-identified neoliberal. There aren't that many people like that out there. But
that subreddit, the neoliberal subreddit is amazing.
and I think that they're misunderstanding the source of the frustration. It's not like the dead end of your like dreamed of, like professional managerial class career is the thing that's making you mad. It's that in the same process that you're discovering that actually you're like college degree from like a 4-year university is not going to actually set you on a track to success, you're also dealing with some other basic stuff that really fucking sucks.
Yeah.
Like housing is extraordinarily expensive, and the amount that you're getting paid is not enough to cover housing and to live like a comfortable life. It just stresses you the fuck out. And then suddenly you like that happens for a few years, and then you turn 26 and you get kicked off healthcare, and the jobs that have been available for you this whole time are not jobs that come with healthcare.
Yeah,
like
if you bump your tooth,
increasingly do they come with
fucked.
healthcare.
Right.
So I actually think that's what's happened. That's what's happened to this sort of portion of the like socialist left, is really not the encounters with like the broken or dashed dreams of like unique, special individuality, but like maybe there's a little bit of that in the background. But at the same time that you're experiencing that sort of collapse, you're also experiencing the cold, hard realities of being a proletarian person under capitalism. You may not have the exact same background as the majority of the working class, but you still are a person who has to work for a living, and you have to work for every scrap, including, the roof over your head and, your health care. And if you decide that you want a better job, you have to, continued education is something that's not always available to you. And I think a lot of people have actually encountered that, and it's radicalized them. But I will say another note on this, like, people seem contemptuous of the fact that it's this portion of the broad working class that has experienced a sort of light bulb turning on around socialism, but it's not an accident. It's a product of history. So McCarthyism severed the organic links between socialists and the working class, and socialism had to retreat into the only safe space available to it, decreasingly safe over time, which is the academy. And who is at the same time, tuition costs are rising. Academy gatekeeping is getting more and more intense, especially in the humanities. So who's getting even access to these ideas? It's people who come from middle-class families whose parents can afford to send them, or half afford to send them to college, right? And so there is a resurgence, and the resurgence of socialism has to do with the broader empirical process of the collapse of living standards for working class people across the board. But the people who have the language available to them immediately right in front of their eyes, and the sort of analytical tools available to them, are a specific section of the working class that is college educated at this moment. Now, it's our responsibility as socialists who went to college, I don't know if you guys did, but I did, to build a different kind of movement. We can't be the coalition that carries this thing to completion, but neither can we call it quits and go home because we don't think that we're the right people to do this. Somebody has to do this, and you never know which section of the working class is going to wake up at any given time. Like when you think about the Russian Revolution, I mean, Lenin was part of student groups at the very beginning of that revolution. And that's where the sort of passion for Marx and Engels and socialist ideas was coming from. And it very quickly proletarianized, in large part because they worked really hard to suture the fracture between the rest of the working class and the sort of like not bourgeois, but, more middle class element of the working class.
Yeah.
I also think part of the reason that there's been this resurgence in socialist ideals doesn't only come from like this specific class of people that we're talking about, but
Benjamin didn't go to college.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But things like Black Lives Matter and like just a very
the internet,
very
us seeing people murdered. Yeah.
Like show constantly happening in front of everyone's eyes that there's like so much state violence happening. This at the same time that people are starting to not just recognize the reality of climate change, but start to deal with climate disaster in places like here. Like it's happening in the United States. People are understanding that it matters. I think that has a lot to do with the sort of awakening of socialism that's currently happening. And I did want to ask you specifically about the differences between Sanders and Warren's approach to something like the Green New Deal and like climate change as like a way to, are we going to be here for the next 200 years if we take these two different approaches?
I mean, I think that it's an open question. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that like if Elizabeth Warren becomes the nominee and then the president, that we are all going to drown. Like, I think that that's a bit alarmist and apocalyptic. At the same time, what it would take to convince Elizabeth Warren to do what we need to do is a lot more than what it would take to convince Bernie Sanders, because his Green New Deal plan is already so much closer to what we know that we need to do in order to save the planet. So that's, I guess, where I want to come down on that question. In terms of the actual differences between the two of them, I did a debate a couple nights ago, and someone on Twitter said that I didn't actually get the details quite right. So I won't go into the actual nitty gritty, because I need to probably spend a little more time reading through both of their plans in great detail before I give you like a full summary. But I'll give you something that I know for certain, which is that at the climate town hall, Elizabeth Warren gave a vision of a Green New Deal or a climate plan that really heavily focused on a particular mechanism for solving the crisis. And that mechanism is building up a robust green domestic manufacturing sector. So the idea is to invest public money in research and development, and then to basically say to companies, if you want to use the fruits of all of this research and development, you have to manufacture your products on American soil. And she said, this is going to create good jobs in the process, and it's going to get us out of this climate crisis hole that we're in. I think it fails on both counts. First of all, why manufacturing in the United States, standards of living for manufacturing workers are sliding rapidly downhill. I don't know why we would just assume that the jobs in the green manufacturing sector are going to automatically be decent jobs. I mean, corporations operate by a very particular logic. They need to cut labor costs in order to increase profits, in order to be competitive on the market. That is what they are compelled to do economically. Doesn't matter who's greedy and who's bad. That's just what they have to do. So if you're handing this over to the private sector, you can guarantee that process is going to be
right. They're just going to go to already exploited areas.
Yeah, of course.
Hire those people.
And then on the other point, basically bringing in corporations as key partners in getting us out of climate change, getting us out of the climate crisis, is very different from what Bernie Sanders wants to do. He basically is saying corporations got us into this mess and they're not going to get us out of it. And so we're just going to take the reins away from them, and we're going to tax the shit out of them and other corporations. And we're going to use the money to build public programs to, revitalize and rebuild America's infrastructure and transition to renewable energies and restore wetlands and, restore sort of environmental areas and tackle environmental racism, do massive cleanup projects and all this stuff. Is like, he's saying that the federal government is going to do that. And the federal government doesn't operate by the same logic as corporations, the logic that I just laid out for you a moment ago. And furthermore, the federal government is heavily unionized already. Right. So I think that Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal plan is going to be significantly better just on the face of it, without me having gone into the details and read every little, granular thing about how exactly we go about building electric cars. Just the very basic fact that on the face of it, Bernie Sanders' plan is significantly better for workers at their work site, and also for ordinary people, whoever they may be out in the world living on this planet, who need clean air and clean water and a clean environment to live in.
Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like he definitely wants to take us in drastic steps towards nationalizing energy. And yes. Elizabeth Warren has not said anything like that.
In fact, she gave an answer to this effect where she said, oh God, it was kind of a remarkable moment that showed, people always say, well, she calls herself a capitalist and he calls himself a socialist, but really they're both, New Deal social democrats, and they just have different preferred labels. And I'm like, first of all, it actually matters a lot that they prefer the labels that right. they do. Bernie Sanders preferring the label of socialist in a capitalist society is an absolutely massive deal. Like, there should be huge exclamation points
and
over
at the
that.
Center of power of it, like to the face of the people who benefit the most from it, he is defying them.
Of course, and then secondly, I think that it actually, these are what you're seeing in these different self-identifications is different professed understandings of political economy.
Right, different diagnoses of what's wrong.
what the problem actually is. And that actually finds its expression in their various plans for how to fix things. And this is a perfect example because Bernie Sanders has said, yes, we're going to either nationalize, energy, or we're going to create, public bodies that can provide public utilities, or change laws so that, public utilities can be formed on a municipal basis. Basically, he's saying like we need to do some sort of nationalization of the energy sector, and there are like different pathways for us to do it. He's extremely open to that idea and wants to pursue it because he likes decommodifying things, because socialists like decommodifying things. On the other hand, Elizabeth Warren was asked by a very brave member of the audience at the Climate Town Hall who was like, Bernie Sanders wants to do this thing. Are you willing to do that thing? Are you willing to call out capitalism in that way? Was his exact phrasing. And she goes, oh, gosh, I just don't think that's, I just don't think that's what gets you there. Like it was a kind of folksy way of saying, no, absolutely not. I'm not interested in impinging on anybody's right to make a profit off of these things. And she did say explicitly, if somebody wants to make a profit off of privately providing, energy, then who am I to tell them no? And that connects to other things that we've heard her say. She said, markets are what make us wealthy. Markets are what create wealth. She said,
I'm not an enemy of billionaires at the last debate.
She said, I don't have any beef with billionaires. Yeah.
Don't even beef. That's even funnier.
I know. Or whatever she said.
It was pretty funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to kind of change the topic a little bit, but let me know if we should talk about this later. I don't know. So another thing with Warren is that when people are like, okay, well, a lot of people, and I was like this in 2016, where I didn't really have a cohesive worldview, and I kind of didn't understand, like I voted for Bernie in the primaries, but didn't really understand why people hated Hillary Clinton so much until I learned more and more and more. And people were like, oh, it's important to have a woman. It's important to have a woman. And like, I work in a school where people, we talk about the difference between substantive representation and like, it's not visual, but it's another representation. And like
tokenization kind of thing? Or?
No, it's like two different words that are both education words. And like one is, I forgot what they are, but one is when you see yourself in your educator and it does make a difference.
Right.
But the other one, which makes more of a difference, is when that person validates you through like action, basically. And it's the same thing, I think, for politics. But a lot of people are still hung up on the idea that like it will help women if we have a woman in office. And the difference is, even though, and I don't believe this, but I'm just saying, like, even though a lot of people believe that, Warren and Bernie are politically different enough that they understand why they're two different candidates running on different platforms. They're like, oh, but it's more important to have a woman in office. Like, I don't know what to say to that other than just like, no, because effectively it will benefit women more if Bernie's in office. But I don't really know what else to say. But what do you say to that? Yeah.
I pretty much say that. I mean, basically, I pretty much say like there are more women in this country than the ones who are running for president.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's not the only like woman in the country. And like, and obviously if you say that, then people will say, but it would be so enormously inspiring to women if they saw a woman as president. But here's the truth about sexism is like the problems standing in women's way are not that they are not sufficiently inspired.
Right.
Like that is actually so infantilizing and like frankly really sexist. It's like if you just had more confidence in yourself, then you could get out there and perform as well as the men. Maybe you'd get paid as well as men if you had more confidence in yourself. And that is actually the kernel of the logic in there, right? Is like we need a woman president so that so that women can be inspired to like really take the reins.
Right.
And make ourselves.
And I think people also
men.
think that it'll magically make men less sexist. I do think that that's another part of it, which I think is very stupid because of racism and Obama. Like, exactly.
That's what I was.
Which I'm just like, but you can't say that because then people are like, oh, so Obama was bad, and I'm just like, I'm gonna run away.
It's so ahistorical to think that that would magically solve any of these problems. Like, look at India, look at England. Like, there's still sexism in places that have had like women as world leaders. It hasn't fixed the core of the problem.
Yeah, and a lot of women are bad. Yeah.
And I think I did an interview with this woman named Kristen Godsey, who has written about women who lived in the former Soviet Union. And she said something really interesting to me, which is that liberal feminists tend to think of anti-sexism and anti-patriarchy as a sort of individual civilizing mission, where you're sort of like fixing individual men sort of one by one. And there is obviously a much broader project. But even if you felt that the fundamental problem was not that there are, laws in place that keep women down, was not that there, isn't like enough pay for care work, which is traditionally women's work, and so on, reproductive justice is constantly under attack. Even if you felt that it was men's behavior that was the problem, there actually is a structural fix to that as well. I mean, it's not a silver bullet, but based on her research, she's talked about how sexism actually subsided now, of course, sexism was rampant in what became the Soviet countries to begin with. So it's not like it went away or anything. But basically, when women's standard of living and their economic independence increased, they didn't rely on men for financial security, which meant that they could make decisions about which men to associate with based on whether or not they were good or bad, which was actually incentivizing men to be less shitty. And there's like she's done research and ethnographic research on this particular topic. And it's like, even if you felt that the civilizing mission was the main thing, like it still has to be a structural change in order to do that on a mass scale.
That's so funny how you're sort of flipping, like it's basically like the capitalist expectation of like the best rise to the top, but flipping it. But does that make any sense? No.
Yes. But it does actually.
Yeah. Okay. Good. You understand what I'm saying? Like for men, because if there's no money, then they just have to be better. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So
I
I'm sorry.
love
Go on.
this approach. Personally, this is fantastic.
Benjamin has $3.
So, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm just going to back up and say that another thing that I say when I'm talking to people about this is that I am actually genuinely very excited for the rise of women politicians. But I reserve my enthusiasm the most for democratic socialist women politicians.
Right. Yes.
I know that they have other women's backs in a way that non-democratic socialist women politicians cannot be said to. Just like, even if they're progressives like Elizabeth Warren and generally like pretty decent, like I believe in my heart that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez like has women's backs in a substantively different way. And what I say then is that Bernie Sanders has been, by changing politics in this country, paving the way for more AOCs.
Right.
And I try to, luckily she's around because we can this doesn't have to be a hypothetical, right? And luckily she just endorsed him. So
that rules.
Yeah.
So we read an article of yours in Jacobin about the Supreme Court decision on whether or not you can fire people for being LGBTQ. And it seems, full disclosure, I ran out of time before I finished the article. But so first I'm going to ask you if my understanding of your argument is accurate, and then I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. So were you saying that basically expecting your rights to come top down is like a bad bet versus like unionization or actually exercising the power that you have? Go ahead.
Well, pretty much. I mean, it's certainly not to discount the necessity of anti-discrimination laws.
Right.
It's just that those are obviously insufficient. I mean, they're obviously insufficient because it's been illegal to discriminate against workers for their race and their gender since 1964. I mean, how many people have been discriminated at work for their race and their gender since 1964? It's like, you can make it illegal, and it's important to have those laws there so that you can refer to them as you fight for yourself. But that's their primary value, is like a benchmark as you advocate for yourself.
And what is the mechanism that you propose for actually securing your rights?
So we need to have, basically we just need stronger workplace rights. There are two major things. Building unions. I mean, every worker deserves a union, full stop. That's like something that I firmly and fully believe. Yeah. And right now union density is really low in the United States, which is a result of like neoliberal class war over the course of four decades. And we need to build back up the labor movement so that more workers have unions, because even when there isn't an anti-discrimination law in place, unions actually can write anti-discrimination clauses into their contracts. Right. And so, for example, there are like 30-something states where it's completely legal to discriminate against somebody for being transgender. And in those states, the only way that a transgender worker has protection against discrimination at work is if they are lucky enough to have a union that has a clause in the contract that says that you can't discriminate against transgender people. So in that way, unions can not only help workers refer to the laws that exist and say, look, the employer's breaking the law, like help me navigate this situation, but they can actually write their own new little micro laws in the form of a contract. So unionization is the first one. And then the second one is actually really massive. And this goes back to Bernie and Elizabeth Warren as well, which is that we need to eliminate at-will employment. So at-will employment refers to the boss can just fire you for whatever reason. It doesn't have to do with your job.
Oh, yeah, we know. We live in Louisiana.
Right.
Yeah,
I don't have a contract at my work. I sign a term sheet, and it doesn't mean anything.
Right. And it's a massive loophole for discrimination firings where you're just like, it was not a good fit for the culture or whatever.
Exactly. And like, even if there's a law in your state or even a federal law that says that you can't do that, I mean, you just got fired. You need to go find a new job. You don't have the time or the energy to fight your previous employer.
Yeah.
So if you as long as you have at-will employment, this is going to be the case. Now, people who are in unions don't have at-will employment. If your union contract will typically stipulate that you can only be fired for reasons that are actually laid out in your union contract. So I'm a unionized worker, and I can't be fired just because Bhaskar Sankara feels like it. Like, he has to do performance reviews with me where we go over my contract and talk about how I haven't met like the stipulations in my contract, and I have to be given a chance to actually do better. And then if I fail a certain number of times, then I can be fired. So it
Do you
actually
think you
makes
could be fired for
your
appearing
union
on this
contract
podcast?
Makes it so that you cannot be fired at a whim. Like, you have to be fired for job performance reasons. So we can actually change this on a national level. It doesn't have to be union shop by union shop. And Bernie Sanders' labor plan, he's proposing to end at-will employment, and Elizabeth Warren's labor plan, she is not proposing to end at-will employment.
I don't know. Okay. I'm a little bit tipsy, so I'm just going to jump right into this. But I feel like, okay, do you think that Elizabeth Warren... You do think that she lied about being fired for being pregnant, or do you not? Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, me too. That's how I feel about it.
I don't know.
Yeah.
All I know is that I made a tweet that consisted of 6 words and a screenshot, and suddenly it was like, everybody wanted my head to roll. So the only reason this ever came up, and if you're listening to this podcast and you don't know what this is about, just fast forward. You don't need to know. This is just some stupid shit that happened in my life. The reason this came up is because my partner is building a lifelong career out of being a public school teacher. Right. It's a real job you can have. It's actually the most common job in America.
Right.
And I find it a little bit annoying that Elizabeth Warren is constantly referring to herself as a former public school teacher.
Right. She did it for one fucking year. Yeah.
Even because she only taught for 1 year. If you've taught for like a year, you can go off in the quote unquote education space and call yourself a former public school teacher.
Right.
And it shouldn't be like that. I mean, there are people like lifelong career teachers should be the people, like, it's stolen valor. Like, these are the people whose expertise we should trust.
Yes,
and there's a real reason for that, which is that we actually in our fight for, equality in education, one of the cornerstones of that is that we need to be turning trust over to teachers who know best. They know their working conditions. They know how to manage classrooms. I mean, it's extremely infantilizing, actually, and tends to actually be a way for consultants and ed policy people to say that they know better than teachers. And usually what that means is breaking unions, paying teachers less, growing class sizes, and so on. So, like, that's where my head was in the whole thing, was like, I'm annoyed that Elizabeth Warren thinks that it's okay to say that she's to constantly... Not just
Which I totally agree with. I think it's extremely fucked up to be like, to frame yourself that way if you've only worked 1 year.
She basically, she triangulates more than Bernie Sanders does. So she's, I think, looking at the lay of the land at the moment as she drafts her platform. But yeah, that's where it came from. I think that it's pandering. Like
Right.
it's not the gravest sin in the world. I'm not saying that she should be, she should drop out on the basis of this alone. But I think it's pandering as somebody who not just my partner, but many people in my life, many of my loved ones are teachers. And I think that it's pandering to say I'm a former public. People think that she taught for like a long time in public schools when she says that. And
it's even worse than Buttigieg
the reason
talking
why
about
we
himself
ended
as a
up going.
troop.
Sorry, what's that?
I said it's even worse than Buttigieg talking about himself as a troop, even though he was just like a pencil pusher.
Yeah,
Like
teachers actually do good
spreadsheet
stuff.
dude.
It's kind of the same thing, actually. She's like kind of indicating that she was a troop in public education.
Right.
And now the reason this went off the rails is because somebody said, well, she was fired for being pregnant, which I should have just not responded to, frankly. But it turns out that if you Google Elizabeth Warren fired pregnant, which I did in that exact moment, it is on the first fucking page of that Google search result that you will discover that she in 2007 said something very different. And I've since learned that I was not the first person to discover this. In fact, I won't say names, but a very prominent right-wing PAC
That's how it happened.
this.
Okay.
And that they had tipped off probably the Warren campaign, which probably tipped off CBS, which started an investigation on this months ago. So I just waltzed right into a
Man, I feel so bad for people on the internet who have followings. Oh, that sucks.
I mean, basically, any time any like solid criticism of Warren that you offer from the left will be immediately associated with a right-wing criticism because they've done all the oppo already. And, you know what I mean? And like
Also,
they have it locked and
all
loaded.
like the super like all the very like liberal feminist anti-Bernie people are always going to be like, yeah, well, she's just a right-wing fucking whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like it's annoying. I mean, also it does seem like she was lying. The only reason I don't want to say that she was lying about it for a pandering point is that it feels like it also is it's equally possible that she just never mentioned that she was fired for being pregnant because it's not cool to talk about like woman stuff. You know what I mean? So then, I mean, I'm sure you've already considered all of these angles because you got attacked for it online by everybody.
Well,
but
back then it was just such a terrible culture.
But also when she made the statement in 2007 or whatever, it was just that she just did not acknowledge getting fired for being pregnant and said that she had chosen a different job. And it's sort of plausible that she had done that because she was just like, I'm not going to mention this because it's not politically palatable.
Right.
Totally. I think it's completely plausible. I would like for it to be on the record that I have not attempted to go on a crusade to convince people.
Of course not. Yeah.
Right.
But people went on a crusade against you to make it seem like you were on a crusade against Elizabeth Warren.
Well, yeah, I was genuinely on a crusade against the idea that Elizabeth Warren should be allowed to call herself a former public school teacher.
Sure, which is fair.
I don't care about this whole pregnancy discrimination thing. And I also did not know that it was like, hadn't already been like, I didn't realize I was like, like that I was surfacing something.
Right.
And unearthing something. And furthermore, unearthing something that very powerful people already had their eye on.
Right.
And like, we're looking for like, I threw like a match on the fire.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
You were just like fact checking a Twitter asshole and you accidentally like set yourself on fire.
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah.
And it sucked. It has been, I've been, basically called a misogynist like every day since that happened.
Moira Donegan.
You seem like a real bro to me. No.
I'm a huge bro.
Moira Donegan,
I just like women immensely.
Friend of the show, Moira Donegan, cited that whatever scoop or whatever you want to call it, and called it a misogynist like essay, and just very carefully omitted like your gender, which I mean, whatever. There's such a thing as internalized misogyny, but
I honestly think internalized misogyny is mostly a stupid thing that people made up because I do feel like women can be mad at other women. I feel like also women who are misogynist against other women are just misogynists, and it's not internalized misogyny. You just don't like women, and that's okay. Anyway,
well, it's funny because like the way that. I guess the basis upon which people wanted to say that I was being a misogynist was that I had questioned a woman's story about discrimination.
Right.
And I just want to be super clear that A, don't really care about this. B, if a woman who was not running for president as i.e. like Elizabeth Warren in her early 20s came to me and said I was fired for being pregnant, I would say, I believe you, that shit happens constantly.
Right.
And the reason that I found cause to like note the discrepancy is because this woman is running for the highest office in our country, which is just different from like the average woman walking around. So like I wouldn't just run around and be like, oh yeah, like to any random woman, be like, well, you said this and blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't. Anyway, I kind of regret the whole thing because it's just been such a shit show for me personally.
Yeah. I'm sorry to bring it up.
I don't even know that this is like a useful thing. Like I said, when I opened the show, I much prefer the elevated sort of political conversation. And this was literally deep in a comments thread on Twitter that this whole thing started. So never tweet.
If Bernie wins and if Corbyn and Labour take office in the UK and they really do abolish private schools like they're proposing, it would set such a precedent for
that would rule.
The left in the West. It's kind of a dumb term, but it would just be amazing for America to have to reckon with the idea that there is an entirely different class of people that get to go to these elite institutions from the time they're babies until they go to Harvard and become warmongers.
We're a very long way off from that in the United States, but I'm very inspired by the Abolish Eton campaign that's coming out of the UK. I mean, I think that they're just ahead of us on this front. It's partly because their class consciousness is much sharper in the UK. It's funny, actually, they have a little bit of like in the United States, everybody is just sort of calls themselves most people think of themselves as the middle class, even though that's not true. Really, really wealthy people will say that they're upper middle class, and like very obviously working class people will say that they're middle class, or maybe lower middle class. And like, so we have a big fucked up problem in terms of how people relate to class and class identity in the United States. It's all the waters are all muddied. But in the UK, they have a slightly different problem, which is that working class has become like almost a congenital identity in a way. So like, for example, I remember like Russell Brand like comes from working class background, but is like an extraordinarily rich actor now and like still identifies as working class, I think because it's a cultural identity.
Yeah, as Joe Biden would say, it's a mindset.
It's a mindset. Well, actually, Joe Biden's a very good example because he's like union job. He's like working class Joe, right? Like, and that. So he's got that. What's going on in the UK is a little more similar to that.
Right.
That said, they're still in a better position than us with that kind of working class identity politics over there because class is just more front and center. And that is why they've been able to, for example, like push this abolish Eton campaign. It's because that like translates to people in the UK more than it translates in the United States.
I don't understand. I mean, I do. I understand all the forces at work for the past, decades that have led us to this, but it just seems so intuitive that like private school kids suck to me, and it's insane.
I went to private school.
And exception that proves the rule.
Yeah.
You guys are the good ones.
A lot of people went to private school in New Orleans. Yeah, a lot of white people.
For a second, I guess.
Yeah, you did. You went to
school. Yeah.
Then
I quit.
It's a private school. It's a Catholic school.
I quit Catholic
See what
school.
I'm saying? Proof of concept
well, actually,
immediately.
This kind of nitpicking and differentiating brings me to it seems that whether or not you're working class or middle class, the accretion of wealth at the very, 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 very top kind of condenses those distinctions to be borderline irrelevant. Like even the PMC is getting like fucking. I mean, it's like I am probably a member. I would consider myself a member of the PMC, and I'm also a freelancer, and like I have no job security whatsoever.
And you're poor.
I pay out the fucking ass for healthcare that doesn't pay for my meds, like all sorts of shit.
Like I went to a private school that's one of like the most expensive in New Orleans, and I didn't have healthcare forever and have medical debt. Like it's It's unless you're extremely, extremely wealthy, it kind of doesn't really matter that much.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. I mean, and my thing the question that I opened with about downward mobility and like entitlement or whatever, that wasn't meant to be a criticism of the American left, but I do think that it's like a very, very interesting phenomenon and like a great example of the power of disappointment in mobilizing people. And I think that there's a way to like, I mean, I'm making it sound like it's a propaganda effort or whatever, but like I feel like there's a way to communicate to people that to like working class people who were born and raised working class, like that they have been let down gravely also. And the kind of condescending way I'm talking about working class people right now brings me to another question that I have, which is like, what do you feel about? So the idea of false consciousness, there's like two sort of critiques on either side of it. There's like the identity pol liberal one is like if a working class person is racist, then fuck them, they're dead to me or whatever. And then on the other hand, there's it's so condescending to talk about false consciousness. Like where do you fall on the false consciousness question?
Well, I think that there are so many people and so many ways to think that you will never ever get everybody thinking in unison, nor would you necessarily want that. And
Right.
So if you want to call that false consciousness, fine, but I just think that there's a degree of variation in the way that people understand their relationship to society that we should expect.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal of socialists is to like increase class consciousness to whatever extent is possible and whatever extent is necessary
Right.
to make social change. And I think that basically the way that I see the last 40 years having played out is that socialism becomes anathema in the United States due to Cold War efforts and the rise of neoliberalism. And, austerity and privatization are implemented and bear down upon people, while at the same time their class consciousness is being very concertedly eroded, and radicals are being purged from public life left and right. So nobody is capable of providing the sort of ideological leadership that is necessary to make sense of that. And so other ideological explanations come in to fill the gap. And there are two major ones. And one of them is sort of liberal meritocracy, which is sort of like, the liberal meritocracy is not like totalizingly hierarchical. Like conservatives are like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like, you piece of shit. If you're down and out, it's because you're like actually bad. And like the social Darwinists, it's like extremely
Right.
punitive. And then so that's one of them. And the other one is liberal meritocracy, which is a little bit more benevolent and a little bit kinder. And it says like, well, we need to change the rules of the game to allow meritocracy to work. It sort of acknowledges
Right.
that there are obstacles to meritocracy. So it's acknowledging that there's a flaw in the right-wing version of events.
But you should have to work to achieve basic human rights.
Right. And it's saying, let's clear the obstacles to let people compete against each other so that meritocracy actually works. Right. And those are the two ideological explanations for inequality that emerge in the vacuum of the socialist explanation. And the socialist explanation is basically like, this is not a competition among equals, nor will it ever be, ever. This is just a system of subjugation and domination and oppression. That's what this is. And it will always be like that until we eliminate, private ownership over the means of production, to use the Marxist phraseology. But without socialists there to make that case, you basically get these two competing explanations. And that kind of sums up what the battle between liberals and conservatives has been for like the last 30 years, is people on the right who are like, if you are down and out, it's because it's your own damn fault. And people on the center, which they would consider themselves the left, saying, well, it's not your fault because there are problems with the system, but we do want to fix the system such that you can actually prove yourself. And then if we were to do that and you were to still be falling behind, yes, it would absolutely be your fault.
And also, if you smoke pot or you're black, we're going to jail.
Right.
What made you a socialist, or have you always been a socialist ever since you had like a political ideology?
I mean, I've always been a leftist since I had a political ideology, and always significantly to the left of center. And
Can
I'm
I
always pretty
interrupt for a second? Ask if you were. Can I ask your age?
31.
Were you an anarchist in high school?
I was an anarchist in college, so close enough.
Okay.
I went to high school in Texas and I didn't know any anarchists. I mean, I think that I was aesthetically drawn to anarchism because that's what was on offer. And like, I remember that I would go to Whole Foods with my parents and I would pick up copies of Advanced. So like,
Yeah.
Were your parents liberal or were they also
liberal.
leftist?
Yeah. My parents, my parents are like,
Obama liberals.
Like bougie Obama liberals.
This keeps coming up on the podcast that everyone who's like been a leftist for a long time was like,
Went to a Rage Against the Machine show.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It was like a very specific, like, you'd see like fuck Bush signs everywhere. And
Yeah.
it was like, all right, I'm going to hang out with my anarchist food not bombs friends. And now we're all communists.
Yeah, what was the role of foreign policy in your radicalization? Like, what was that an ingredient?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do remember that I was anti-war
Yeah.
and that I knew that George W. Bush was bad and that I understood vaguely that there were anti-war protests happening and that I was on the side of those people, whoever they were, though I didn't know them because I was very young.
Yeah.
And not in a community where that was like available to me. When I sort of started to encounter identity politics a little bit when I was like an older teenager because I came out as queer when I was 15. And so I found my way, thanks in large part to the internet, found my way into discursive circles that helped explain that to me, and that opened the gate for other stuff. And I would credit that for introducing me to a lot of radical leftist ideas, which I'm very grateful for, but it also introduced me to a whole load of crap that took a long time to unlearn.
Were you on Tumblr?
What's that?
Were you on Tumblr?
This is pre-Tumblr, so this is
Okay.
like LiveJournal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I went to Oberlin College starting in 2007, which
hell yeah.
is like
We started college at the same time. You graduated high school 2007. Yeah.
Yeah. And to go, so that was basically living Tumblr. Like, it was like IRL.
Tumblr University.
Wait, did you? No, never mind. She didn't go there. Never mind.
Go ahead.
I was sort of steeped in that kind of like it was a very sort of self-regulatory, almost like panoptic kind of
absolutely.
identity politics that I participated in and thought was politics. And I actually, like I said, I did encounter important ideas that aided my political development during that time, but it was just so consuming. The idea that you had to behave in a perfect manner and watch other people it was always about like, it was like a self-betterment project. Your whole life was a self-perfection project. And the problem was that meant that you didn't ever organized for anything ever. And I remember like at Oberlin sitting around like just thinking like we should like do something. Like we're very political. Like we should do like stuff. And then we just never did. I mean, other people presumably did on campus, but the people that I was hanging out with, I did not really organize anything effective with anybody the entire time I was on campus, but I saw a million little scandals and, participated in them to some extent. I mean, just like on the periphery, I was never like a super intense, like social justice warrior, but I got really burned out by the end of my time at college, and I kind of backed away from, there are other little bits and pieces to the story, I won't tell the whole thing, but I backed away from politics a lot, like because that was so toxic and so ineffective. Like I think I was smart enough even at that time to know that we ought to be trying to change the world and like do mass politics of some kind. And it wasn't until like 2013, 2014 that I started reading Jacobin. And I was like, oh, right, this is what's been missing is like some sort of structural explanation, which might contain a roadmap for how one might intervene effectively in the state of affairs instead of just sniping at each other and ranking each other.
It's so crazy to me when people like frame students who are going to public or private universities, but especially like prestigious universities, as being radicalized. And it's like, no, it's Jacobin is doing that. The universities are not doing that. Kids tend to be that way.
I mean, I was radicalized by a literary criticism class plus Tumblr also. There's an interesting way in which like the sort of like there are legitimate critiques of the term identity politics, but when I use it, I just mean like class exclusive identity politics, I guess. And like, it's like you were talking about like Tumblr identity politics or like live journal identity politics as like this phenomenon of like self-perfection.
Well, on that note, I mean, I wrote an article, I think in like 2017 for Jacobin, called Under Neoliberalism, You Can Be Your Own Tyrannical Boss.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it does make mention of this. I mean, basically, it talks about the psychological phenomenon of neoliberal perfectionism,
Yes.
which is where you are, because
my
of meritocracy, you're always working to perfect yourself so that you don't fall behind, and how this can manifest itself in political ideology as well, and that so-called call-out culture, I don't know if you want to call it that, I don't much care either way, is kind of a manifestation of that like tendency toward self-perfectionism. It's almost got a religious quality.
It is aesthetic. Like
it is.
People take it so far as to think that the things they consume and the art that they appreciate or their relationship with media has to be politically perfect to the point where they like lose focus of other people around them.
Also, like the idea that it. No, I can tell you want to say what you want to say.
Well, this is what I was getting at is like the like perfectibility of self as politics is like kind of the mirror image of scapegoating immigrants for taking jobs or whatever. It's the bootstrap version of politics. Like above a certain class level, I guess.
Joker is a good movie. That's what I'm gonna say. I think that the idea that it matters what songs you listen to. No, I don't. I mean, I hate R. Kelly. I don't think it matters if you play Ignition once on Spotify. I hate R. Kelly. Yeah. I hate him a lot. But like, I think that like. I hate Gary Glitter. I don't think it matters that his song's in Joker. Like, I think that like the idea that the media that you consume matters is very stupid.
Well, people have been told that they have no political power other than what
consumption.
They consume.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. And you know, it wasn't quite that bad, I guess, when I was at Oberlin. Maybe I'm like exaggerating it a little bit. I want to say that I did encounter like important political concepts that like aided my development. It's just that there was something else that was simultaneously hindering my development at the same time. And it was really contradictory. And when I showed up, actually, when I first got to Oberlin, I had, I don't know, some kind of desire to be involved in class-based organizing. So I ended up going to joining United Students Against Sweatshops. And I got a job in the purchasing office where I was like looking at the things that Oberlin College was buying to make sure that they weren't made in sweatshops, which was like a job that some student protests of a previous era had won and a student would always fill. And that was my job for a year. And that's what I wanted. Like, I wanted to have politics like that. I mean, I didn't know where they were going to go, but that was my initial interest. And there were like 2 members of United Students Against Sweatshops on the Oberlin campus, me and somebody else.
Oh man.
And like I was the only person in that office doing that job. And I'm not saying that there weren't other people with class politics on campus. It's just like that wasn't the dominant political conversation. And so it kind of I almost showed up with the right instincts and they got sucked out of me. And I think that Occupy and Jacobin returned them to me. And I do want to give Occupy credit for that, even though I think we can all agree that there were some major flaws with Occupy. I'd certainly, I participated in it. I know it was flawed. But the 99% versus the 1% like really got lodged in my brain. Right. And I think it actually helped me be like, when I first started reading Jacobin, I was so ready. Like I was like primed. I felt like I was drinking water after being in the desert for a long time, you know?
Right. I mean, and this is, it's like the phenomenon of knowing deep down that something is wrong, but just being ideologically blinded to the actual answer. And this is what I was getting at with the immigration thing versus the identity politics thing is like, on both sides, it like the diagnosis of the fact that there is a problem, totally fucking accurate. But you are, for any number of reasons, you don't have access to the class analysis, I guess. Yeah. Yeah,
I think that's right.
We're probably getting sort of close to wrapping up time, and there's one thing I definitely wanted to ask you as someone who's, as we've gone through this entire conversation, like come out as sort of a leading voice in the like substantive differences between Warren and Sanders. And I think one thing I've noticed in people who I think have a fairly complex understanding of capitalism and the way it functions, our government, the way it functions, but they still have some sort of doubt about Sanders, is that they don't think that he can get things done in our government because he's so far off. And I think they see Warren as someone who may compromise on things, but that as a potential strength of hers. And I guess I maybe just speak on what you think the strengths of that approach are, what the weaknesses of that approach are, and like what the alternatives to that approach are in the sense of gaining political power.
Yeah, I think that that's actually the main question that faces us. Believe it or not, the main question is not whether or not Elizabeth Warren lied about being discriminated against for being pregnant. It's completely irrelevant. The real question is who can get shit done. But there's a sub-question, which is what do you want to get done?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that, you know, with Elizabeth Warren, if she were president, she would be a perfectly serviceable progressive president for 4 to 8 years, and she would get a small amount of stuff done, and most of it would be pretty decent. I think that Bernie Sanders would potentially get more done in both in terms of what he's capable of passing, because there's the question of negotiation. It's like, so if Elizabeth Warren's strength is that she triangulates, that also means that she's going to have a tendency to pre-compromise, which means that whatever she gets passed is going to be diminished compared to what Bernie Sanders might be able to get passed.
That's the way of the Democratic Party, is pre-compromise.
Right. And Bernie Sanders, if he were to get his agenda passed, I don't think he would negotiate from a position of strength. I just know that based on observing him for an extremely long time, very up close and personal, and he would be less likely to compromise. And so whatever he could get passed would be much more comprehensive, much more universal, and much more transformative for working people. But that's not the only thing that we want to get done. So it is possible that Elizabeth Warren might be able to get more small things passed than Bernie Sanders would be able to get big things passed, right? But there's another, and I don't know. It could be, or maybe
it's
not.
all speculative, but it's worth noting.
It's all speculative, yeah. But there's another thing that we want to get done, which is fundamentally transforming American politics to redistribute wealth and power away from the richest people in the country to the working class, and empowering and galvanizing and inspiring the working class to fight even harder for more ambitious gains and victories down the line. And that is not something that we're going to get with a perfectly serviceable progressive for 4 to 8 years, even though I would vastly prefer that person to, say, Joe Biden, right? And certainly prefer that person to Donald Trump. So Bernie Sanders has something unique, which is that and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said this in her endorsement of him. He doesn't see the movement that he's building as like a vehicle to get him elected so much as he sees his campaign as a constituent part of a movement that's going to transcend his bid for the presidency, or if he becomes president, transcend his presidency itself. And then furthermore, if he were to be president, he really genuinely believes that the most ambitious stuff that he's planning on fighting for and not planning on pre-compromising on is only possible if there's extra parliamentary pressure from the working class. So like, he's not going to be able, so the state is fundamentally beholden to the capitalist class under capitalism. It doesn't even matter if politicians are good and they have good ideas and they're good in their hearts. They are sorry. All good.
Yeah, we're good.
So it doesn't matter what's in their hearts. The capitalist class is holding the economy hostage. They can actually tank the economy if they don't like the things that politicians do. So, and furthermore, they actually then on top of that, they bankroll politicians' careers and so on. So politicians are not going to contravene the wishes of the capitalist class unless that, as I've often said, there's like a dictum from the capitalist class that the working class agitation can transform into an ultimatum at the very least. Like you have to choose one or the other, and there are consequences both ways. And so I think Bernie thinks that he's not going to get Medicare for all passed unless that dictum is turned into an ultimatum, unless there's a mass movement that's threatening politicians' careers or that's holding capitalist profits hostage in the form of strikes or disruptive protests or things like that. And I think he's really banking on that movement and planning to use the office as an opportunity to build that movement. Because it's how he sees change happening. And I want a president who thinks like that. I mean, that is a socialist understanding of political economy, one rooted in class struggle. And I don't think Elizabeth Warren has that same understanding. So even if she got some good stuff done, I mean, it could all just get undone if we got a
exactly.
That,
it's not
it seems like one of my hobby horses that it seems like she with co-determination is the thing that always gets thrown in your face when you're talking about labor and Bernie versus Warren or whatever. But it seems that she is trying to say, we will top down grant you the sort of power, grant the labor movement a certain amount of power from top down that in every other country has been attained only through like strikes and like solidarity and tenacity. Do you want to talk a little bit about Warren's co-determination plan?
I don't think so, because I need to spend some time learning about Bernie's recent offerings on this front so that I can contrast them, which I was actually planning on doing in the last few days, and then I just didn't. So I think we'll skip that one. But I will say one thing on the previous point that you brought up in terms of like the gains that have been achieved in other countries through class struggle. I think that's so important. It's like people will say, oh, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are both social democrats. And, social democracy is a very squishy concept. So in the sense that Bernie Sanders is not advocating that capitalism be like obliterated immediately and also wants, progress and reform. And so does Elizabeth Warren, while also calling herself capitalist to her bones, then yeah, I guess you could call them both social democrats. But the truth of the matter is that social democracy, as actually existing social democracy, such as in Scandinavia, was only won because there were socialists fighting they were waging class struggle. There were working people and socialists fighting for socialism, and that produced the gains that have now stalled out in the sort of intermediate scenario that we call social democracy. And I think Bernie Sanders' whole purpose right now, and this is the legacy that he wants to leave humanity, is that he's trying to use social democratic demands to build a vehicle for class struggle that could actually fight for something even more ambitious than social democracy, and then perhaps even attain social democracy, and then perhaps attain something more than that. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And social democracy was some sort of staying power that isn't unwindable. Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously it would have been amazing had he been the candidate and defeated Trump last time, but his candidacy already a year ahead of the general election, if he becomes a candidate, has galvanized so many people in such a specific way where this class understanding is happening that it seems like sort of the perfect moment. So
I kind of like how this has gone in a way. I don't like that Donald Trump is our president, let me be clear. But the class consciousness that people started to develop in 2016, like there's not another Bernie Sanders waiting in the rosters.
No.
So the fact that he ran again is giving all of those people the opportunity to actually hone their understanding and arguments. And the fact that Warren is running against him is actually really exciting in that regard, because this is a very elevated conversation that we're having compared to last time. And I actually think that this is a fucking crash course for American socialists, and really genuinely the fighters of the next decades are being born in this moment. Like and we don't even know who all of those people are, but we're going to start seeing in the next 5 and 10 years who they are and what they've learned. And it's really thrilling.
What do you think? I mean, we should probably wrap up soon, but what do you think inoculated the Sanders campaign in 2016 against bread baiting? Like, was it just the passage of time since the Cold War, or like why was that not kind of dead in the water?
So Bernie has managed to avoid red baiting by saying that he's a socialist, which means that he wants dignity and security and equality and democracy, and that that's his long-term, extremely long-term program, and that his short-term program is healthcare for all and education for all. And he's not talked about the intermediate program, which is where the shit gets really like iffy. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
And like that's actually kind of brilliant. It really pisses off long-time socialists because they're like, well, are we gonna have a planned economy or not?
Right.
Like, tell me, and like if you won't tell me, then I'm just gonna say that you're like a lame social democrat. Fuck off. But this is how he's managed to avoid red baiting, is because he's basically he's like decided to black out all that stuff in the middle. That's for the future movement that he's like bringing into being right now.
Somebody else can expropriate.
And so he's only associating socialism with really, really good shit way down the line, like principles like dignity and equality and security, and really, really good shit in the extremely short term that people want, like healthcare and education. So you call him a socialist and he just goes, yeah, I'm a socialist, and socialism stands for all that. You got a problem with any of that? And it's like kind of brilliant, actually.
Yeah, I want liberty and justice for all.
Exactly.
Do y'all have anything else you want to ask? Do you have anything that you want to plug?
Yeah, a lot of the ideas that we've discussed here will be discussed in a more formal and probably more eloquent fashion in the book that I'm co-writing with Micah Utricht called Bigger Than Bernie. Tentatively, it's coming out from Verso, I think in maybe like April, so keep an eye out for that. We're trying to write like basically what I just told you about all of the people coming into class consciousness now. We're trying to write like a next steps book for those people.
Right.
Like okay, welcome. Now you have to be a socialist for the rest of your life. You have a choice. And
like
here's how you might go about it.
Yeah.
Sort of building on that a little bit, I want to plug something of yours to everybody listening. Just a very like beautiful and inspiring creative piece that you put in Jacobin probably about a year ago or something like that, is the 1 year off every 7 years piece about the idea of people taking a year-long sabbatical and society getting to the point where people could take a year off to become fuller human beings. Is I think we need to
have more utopian writing.
We need to have more utopian writing. We need to have an understanding that what we're fighting for now is, it's the bread and roses.
You had a lot, like the highlight of my scant research for this interview was like, so Jonathan Van Ness has since come out as like a maybe aggressively anti-Bernie person. However, you wrote an article about like the sort of how Queer Eye for the Straight Guy could be like extrapolated into a politics, if that makes sense. And there's this line that I like wish were Bernie's fucking. I think you probably already know what I'm talking about. I wish it were
exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I wish it were the slogan. So Jonathan Van Ness talks about the person he's making over as struggling to function, but he says Struggs to Func. And you wrote fuck motherfucker. 1 second. You wrote nobody should be Struggs to Func, and that's really what socialism is all about.
I mean, isn't it what socialism is all about?
It is, dude. It's so good.
We should all be seeing the world's wonders and experiencing them, because our lives are short and we are going to die and then we won't get to. Yeah. And that's really unfair that we wouldn't be able to experience as much as we possibly could, as much as society could be arranged to allow us to experience. Right. And furthermore, nobody should be Struggs to Func, because that's just extremely unfair as well. So like that is socialism in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop. Meagan, Dave, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, guys. This was fun.